Beneath the rice paddies of eastern China, just south of modern Shanghai, there's a city that shouldn't exist. Not according to the history books anyway, a walled capital with a population in the tens of thousands. A water management system so advanced that modern engineers still study it today. An elite class buried with jade so finely carved, it looks almost machine-made. And all of this 1,000 years before China's first recognized dynasty even began. Then, sometime around 4,300 years ago, it all just stopped. If you're listening to this while drifting off tonight, tell me where in the world you are and what time it is right now. I love checking the comments and seeing this weird little map form. Someone in Sydney starting their morning coffee. Someone in Toronto finally closing their eyes after a long shift. Someone in Manila listening on their lunch break. Different time zones, different lives, all somehow ending up here together, listening to the same forgotten story. It's a strange kind of connection, and honestly, it's one of my favourite parts of making these. Now, the civilization we're talking about is called Liangzhu, and if you've never heard the name before, don't worry. Most people haven't. For most of the 20th century, historians assumed Chinese civilization began in one place, and one place only. The Yellow River Valley, up in the north, that was supposed to be the cradle. The birthplace. The story always went the same way. Farming communities along the Yellow River slowly grew more complex until eventually, around 2070 BCE, the Jade Dynasty emerged as China's first real state. Clean, simple, linear, except archaeology has a habit of ruining clean, simple stories. Because down in the south, near the mouth of the Yangtze River, something else was happening at the same time, or arguably earlier, and it was arguably more sophisticated than anything happening up north. A society with massive earthen dams, a carefully planned capital city surrounded by walls and moats, elite tombs stacked with thousands of pieces of jade, each one carved with symbols nobody has fully decoded to this day. This wasn't a scattered farming village. This was something that looks uncomfortably like a state, a kingdom, maybe even something we'd hesitantly call an early civilization in its own right. And here's the part that should really grab you. This society thrived for well over 1,000 years, and then it seems to vanish almost overnight. No clear war, no obvious invasion, just abandonment, silence and mud, slowly burying the evidence for the next 4,000 years until farmers and archaeologists started pulling it back out of the ground in the 20th century. Now, before we go further, I want to be careful here, because it's tempting to blow this up into something bigger than it was. Liangzhu was not a unified empire ruling over all of Asia. It didn't control Korea or Japan or the deserts of Central Asia. What it appears to have been is a powerful regional civilization dominant across parts of the lower Yangtze Delta, with cultural and trade influence that likely extended further outward than anyone expected. That's still remarkable. It just isn't the same as ruling a continent. But that regional power is exactly what makes this story so compelling. Because if a civilization this advanced, this organized, this monumental in scale could exist 1,000 years before China's first dynasty, and still be almost completely unknown to most of the world today, you have to wonder what else is buried out there. What other Liangzhus are sitting under rice fields or jungle floors or ocean silt right now, waiting for someone to dig in the right spot? So let's dig in the right spot. Let's go back to the moment archaeologists first realized they weren't looking at just another ancient village, but something that would force historians to rewrite the opening chapter of Chinese civilization. To understand why Liangzhu is such a problem for historians, you first need to understand the story they were trying to protect. For generations, the official narrative of Chinese civilization worked like a straight line. You start with the legendary 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, mythical rulers who may or may not have existed. Then you move into the Jade dynasty, dated to around 2070 BCE, treated as the first real dynasty, the first true state with centralized rule. After that comes the Shang, and then the Zhou, and the line just keeps going, dynasty after dynasty, all the way up to the 20th century. It's tidy, it's teachable, it fits on a timeline in a textbook without any awkward gaps or contradictions. There's just one problem. The Jade dynasty itself is still debated among archaeologists. We have later Chinese texts, written centuries after the fact, describing Xia kings and their accomplishments. We have a site called Erlitou that many scholars associate with the Jia period, complete with palace foundations and bronze workshops. But we don't have anything from the Jia period itself that says, in its own words, at its own time, this is the Jia dynasty. No contemporary inscriptions, no writing system we can definitively tie back to Xia rulers claiming their own name for their own state. Some historians accept Jia as historical fact with reasonable confidence. Others argue it's closer to a foundational legend, a story later dynasties used to explain their own legitimacy. The way many cultures invent a golden age their ancestors supposedly built. The honest answer is we don't fully know yet, and that uncertainty alone should tell you something about how fragile the traditional timeline really is. Now hold that uncertainty in your mind, because here's where Liangzhu makes things even messier. Liangzhu flourished roughly between 3300 and 2300 BCE. Do the math on that for a second. The traditional starting point of Chinese civilization, the Xia dynasty, doesn't even begin until around 2070 BCE. That means Liangzhu had already been thriving for over 1,000 years before Xia supposedly started. It had already built its walled capital, engineered its water systems, developed its jade industry, and organized its society into distinct classes of elites and laborers. And by the time Xia rulers were allegedly consolidating power in the north, Liangzhu had already collapsed. It was gone, buried, forgotten by everyone except the mud that swallowed it. Think about what that means. This wasn't some early, primitive stepping stone on the path toward Chinese civilization. Liangzhu wasn't a simple village that eventually evolved into something more advanced. It was already advanced, it rose, it flourished, it built monuments that still baffle modern engineers, and it fell, all before the story we were taught in school even begins. And it gets stranger when you bring writing into this. The earliest confirmed Chinese writing system, the oracle bone script used by Shang dynasty diviners, doesn't appear until around 1200 BCE. That's roughly 1,100 years after Liangzhu had already vanished. So when historians talk about the beginning of Chinese civilization, what they often really mean is the beginning of written Chinese history. Everything before that gets labelled prehistoric, which is a polite way of saying we don't have written records, so we assume it was less important. But Liangzhu proves that assumption wrong. A society doesn't need writing, at least not writing we've decoded, to build cities, manage water on a massive scale, or organize thousands of laborers into a functioning state. So where did this old narrative come from? This idea that everything meaningful started along the Yellow River in the north? Partly it comes from geography. The Yellow River Valley was where early Chinese texts, myths, and dynastic records were centered. The philosophers, historians, and court scribes who wrote down China's ancient history were writing from a northern perspective, describing northern kings and northern achievements, because that's where their own political and cultural world revolved. Partly it comes from archaeology too, but in a limited sense. Early 20th century excavations happened to focus heavily on northern sites, places like Anyang, associated with the Shang dynasty. Discoveries there were spectacular: oracle bones, bronze vessels, palace foundations, and they reinforced the belief that this was where it all began. The Yellow River model became the accepted framework almost by default, not necessarily because it was proven, but because it was the story that had the most evidence behind it at the time, and the least competition. But archaeology has a nasty habit of blowing up frameworks that seemed settled. As excavations expanded across China throughout the 20th century, researchers started finding sophisticated cultures in places nobody had seriously looked before. Down in the lower Yangtze, there was Liangzhu. Out west, other regional cultures were leaving behind their own distinctive pottery, their own settlement patterns, their own signs of organized society. In the northeast, yet another set of early cultures was developing jade traditions and ceremonial structures of its own. What emerged wasn't one single point of origin radiating outward, like ripples from a stone dropped in water. It looked more like several separate fires burning at once across the map, each one developing complexity somewhat independently, sometimes interacting, sometimes influencing each other, sometimes just developing in isolation until they eventually collapsed or merged into whatever came next. This is now often called the multiple centers model, or sometimes described using the phrase many stars scattered across the sky, a phrase borrowed from Chinese archaeologist Su Bingqi, who helped push back against the old single origin story. Instead of one cradle of civilization, you have several. Instead of one line moving cleanly from north to south, you have a scattered constellation of early cultures, each contributing pieces to what would eventually become Chinese civilization as a whole. And Liangzhu sits right at the brightest point of that southern constellation, because the lower Yangtze wasn't some marginal backwater waiting to be civilized by the north. It was one of the most fertile, resource-rich regions in all of ancient East Asia. Warm, wet, crossed by rivers and wetlands, perfect for growing rice on a scale most of the ancient world couldn't match. It had access to jade sources, to fishing grounds, to fertile floodplains that could support dense populations year after year. This wasn't a place people settled because they had no better options. This was a place worth building an empire around, long before anyone north of the river had a name like Jade to write down. So if the old story was one river, one dynasty, one beginning, the real story looks a lot messier and a lot more interesting. Liangzhu isn't a footnote before Chinese history begins. It might just be one of the opening chapters historians spent a century overlooking, and the first clue that this forgotten southern civilization even existed came from a place that did not look like the birthplace of a lost state. It came from the rice fields. In 1936, a young archaeologist named Shi Xingeng was working near the town of Liangzhu, just northwest of Hangzhou in eastern China. Today, Hangzhou is one of China's great modern cities, a vast urban centre of highways, high-rises and millions of people. But back then this was a watery rural landscape, low hills, canals, villages, fields cut into the mud, the kind of place where ancient objects could sit a few feet below the surface for thousands of years while generations of farmers planted rice directly above them. Shi was not expecting to find evidence of a civilization older than China's first dynasty. He found pottery at first. That probably sounds disappointing. Pottery is everywhere in archaeology. People have been making clay containers for food, water, storage, cooking, and ritual for thousands of years. Find enough broken pots and you know people lived somewhere. But pottery can also tell you who those people were, when they lived, what technologies they had, and whether they belonged to a culture nobody has recognized before. The fragments recovered near Liangzhu were distinctive. They included finely made black pottery, often burnished until the surface had a dark, almost metallic sheen. Some vessels were thin-walled and carefully shaped. This wasn't crude clay slapped together by a few families trying to store grain. It reflected skill, repetition, shared methods, a community of craftspeople working within an established tradition. Then came the jade, and jade changes everything. Jade is difficult to work even with modern tools. It isn't a soft stone you can casually carve with a knife. Nephrite jade is extremely tough, and shaping it requires enormous patience, abrasives, drilling, polishing, and a level of technical knowledge passed down through generations. When early investigators found jade objects in the Liangzhu area, they weren't just finding ornaments. They were finding evidence of people willing to invest huge amounts of labour into objects that had no obvious survival value. Nobody spends weeks or months grinding a hard green stone into a ceremonial object unless that object means something. Status, religion, authority, ancestry, maybe all of them at once. But in 1936, nobody could see the full picture yet. They had fragments, pottery, jade, burials, scattered traces emerging from fields and low hills. Enough to suggest an unknown late Neolithic culture had existed in the lower Yangtze region. Not enough to prove there had been a major centre of power, let alone a city. And then history got in the way. Within a year, the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War devastated large parts of China. Archaeological work became almost impossible in many regions. Researchers were displaced, collections were endangered, funding disappeared. For years, the urgent task was not reconstructing a 5,000-year-old civilization. It was surviving the present. Even after the war, archaeology in China was still developing as a modern discipline. Excavation methods improved slowly, dating methods became more reliable. Survey work expanded, and perhaps most importantly, archaeologists began asking different questions. Early archaeology often focused on the most visible things: tombs, bronzes, written inscriptions, palaces, sites connected to famous dynasties described in ancient texts. Liangzhu had none of the easy markers historians were trained to recognize. No oracle bone inscriptions, no named kings, no obvious Bronze Age royal tombs. No historical chronicle saying, "Here stood the capital of a forgotten southern kingdom." For decades, Liangzhu was known mainly as an archaeological culture, a label researchers use when a group of sites share similar material remains. Similar pottery, similar jade forms, similar burial customs. It was clearly important, but how important? That question remained open. Think of it like finding loose pages from a book scattered across a landscape. At first you can read a sentence here, a name there, maybe recognise that the pages belong together. But you don't know the title. You don't know who wrote it. You don't know whether you're holding a short story, a religious text, or the records of an entire government. That was Liangzhu for much of the 20th century. Researchers kept finding more pages. As archaeological surveys spread across the lower Yangtze after the mid-20th century, the number of Liangzhu-related sites grew. Villages, cemeteries, workshop areas, elevated mounds rising above the wetlands, places where elites had been buried with astonishing quantities of jade, places where ordinary people lived, cooked, farmed, and made the objects that would eventually be placed in those elite graves. By the 1970s and 1980s, it was becoming harder to treat Liangzhu as just another local Neolithic culture. Excavations at sites including Yaoshan and Fanshan uncovered high-status burials containing elaborate jade objects. Kong, the squared tubes with circular interiors, Bai, the flat circular discs, axes and blades that may have been ceremonial rather than practical. Some burials contained dozens of jade pieces, carefully arranged around the dead. Now, jade alone does not automatically mean a king. Archaeologists have to be careful about that. A rich burial could belong to a religious specialist, a clan leader, a hereditary elite, or someone whose status came from ritual power rather than political office. But when the same pattern appears again and again, when some people are buried with extraordinary wealth and others are not, you are looking at a society where rank mattered. And rank on that scale usually means organisation. Someone had to obtain the raw jade, often from distant sources. Someone had to transport it. Someone had to train specialists to shape it. Someone had to decide which people deserved to be buried with it. Behind each polished object was a chain of labour, trade, belief and authority. Still, even then, the true scale of Liangzhu had not fully emerged. The breakthrough came from a deceptively simple realization. Archaeologists needed to stop looking only at isolated sites and start looking at the whole landscape. The lower Yangtze is difficult country for archaeology. Rivers shift, floods deposit sediment, wetlands swallow walls. Later farming cuts through ancient layers. Modern development covers everything with roads and buildings. A city built in a dry desert can announce itself with stone ruins, visible for miles. A city built in a wetland can disappear so completely that people plough over it for thousands of years without realizing what lies beneath their feet. But expanded survey work, aerial mapping, excavation, and large-scale field investigations began revealing patterns too vast to be accidental. Mounds that seemed natural turned out to have been modified or built by people. Raised areas were connected to other raised areas. Ditches, waterways and embankments began appearing across the map. What had looked like scattered settlements started to resemble parts of one enormous planned centre. At the heart of it was the Liangzhu site itself, the place that gave the entire culture its name. This was not merely a village near Hangzhou where unusual pottery happened to be found. It was the central archaeological site of a much larger world. Here, researchers eventually identified the remains of an ancient walled city with an inner and outer settlement area, monumental platforms, canals, and evidence of coordinated construction on a scale no small farming community could have achieved. The city is generally dated to the late 4th and early 3rd millennium BCE. That puts it roughly 5,000 years in the past, before the Shang, before the disputed Xia, before Chinese writing as we can securely identify it. And yet people here were reshaping wetlands, moving vast quantities of earth, concentrating power, and building a centre that may have controlled an extensive surrounding region. That discovery did not arrive in one dramatic afternoon, with an archaeologist brushing dirt from a single lost crown and declaring civilization found. It happened a real way, slowly, frustratingly, through decades of maps, trenches, soil samples, pottery sequences, radiocarbon dates, and arguments between specialists who did not always agree on what they were seeing. And those arguments are still happening. Every new excavation has the power to change the story. A newly identified dam can transform ideas about water management. A workshop can reveal how jade production was organized. A burial can complicate theories about class and ritual. Traces of settlement beyond the city walls can change estimates of population. Even the absence of something matters. No obvious writing system, no confirmed royal names, no simple answer to exactly how this society governed itself. Liangzhu keeps refusing to stay still. The more archaeologists uncover, the less it looks like a minor prelude to later Chinese history, and the more it looks like something far more unsettling. A major civilization that rose in the wetlands of the lower Yangtze built systems powerful enough to transform an entire landscape, then vanished so thoroughly that its existence had to be rediscovered almost by accident. And once the city itself began to emerge from beneath the mud, the next question became impossible to ignore. How did people 5,000 years ago build a capital in a landscape that seemed designed to drown it? The answer was not to escape the wetlands, it was to redesign them. Liangzhu stood in the low, waterlogged plains of the lower Yangtze, near what is now Hangzhou in eastern China. This was a landscape shaped by rivers, seasonal rains, shallow lakes, marshes and channels that could change course without warning. It was rich country. Rice could grow here. Fish, shellfish, waterbirds, reeds, and wild plants were abundant. But it was also dangerous country. A few days of heavy rain could turn fields into lakes. A river overflowing in the wrong place could erase a settlement built at ground level. For most small farming communities, the solution was simple. Build on slightly higher ground, keep the village compact. Stay close to water, but not too close. If the flood comes, move. Liangzhu did something much more ambitious. Its people built a centre directly within this watery world, then raised, enclosed, channeled and managed the ground beneath it. They did not treat the marsh as empty land waiting to be settled. They treated it like a problem that could be engineered. At the heart of the site was a walled inner city covering roughly 3 square kilometres. That is not enormous by the standards of later imperial capitals. But for around 5,000 years ago, in a wetland landscape, it was extraordinary. The walls formed an irregular rounded rectangle, following the terrain rather than imposing perfect geometric lines. They enclosed an area of raised ground where important buildings, elite residences, workshops and ceremonial spaces may have stood. Beyond this inner city was an even larger outer enclosure, surrounding a much wider area of settlement. The outer city covered several more square kilometres, creating a layered urban landscape. There was a protected central core, then a broader zone where more people lived and worked. Beyond that, villages, cemeteries, agricultural areas, waterways and engineered earthworks stretched outward into the surrounding plains. This matters because it tells us Liangzhu was not just a fortified refuge. A wall around a small village can mean fear. A wall around a large planned centre can mean something else entirely. It can mean administration. It can mean control over movement, labour, storage, ritual, and access to power. Who enters the inner city? Who lives near the centre? Who is buried on the great mounds? Who gets to stand close to the people making decisions? Even without written records, cities can reveal their politics through their layout. And Liangzhu's layout suggests that status was built into the landscape itself. The most dramatic feature inside the inner city was Mojiaoshan, a vast artificial platform rising above the surrounding plain. Today it is a broad earthen mound, but in its original form it would have dominated the city. Covering roughly 300,000 square metres, Mojiaoshan was not a natural hill that happened to be useful. Archaeologists believe it was deliberately enlarged and shaped into an elevated centre for political, ceremonial, and possibly residential activity. Think about what that meant in a wetland. Most people lived close to mud, water, crops, and the constant risk of flooding. But above them stood a massive raised platform, a place high enough to remain dry when lower ground turned to swamp, a place visible across the settlement, a place where ceremonies could be held, where elite families may have lived, where rituals involving Jade and ancestors may have unfolded above the ordinary life of the city. It was protection, certainly, but it was also a message. Power lived on higher ground. We cannot say exactly who occupied Mojiaoshan. No inscription tells us the name of a king. No throne room survives with a sign saying, "This is where the ruler sat." The buildings themselves were made largely from wood and other perishable materials, so most have vanished. But the scale and position of the platform make it hard to see it as ordinary housing. This was the centre of something, maybe a palace in the later sense. Maybe a ritual complex controlled by hereditary elites. Maybe both. In early societies, political power and religious power are often difficult to separate. The person who organizes labor may also lead ceremonies. The family that controls access to sacred jade may also control land, food stores, and alliances. At Liangzhu, authority may have been built not just on force, but on the ability to connect the human world to the supernatural one. But before anyone could stand on Mui Ocean, someone had to build it. And that brings us to the material that made Liangzhu possible: earth. The city walls and elevated platforms were constructed largely through rammed earth techniques. Workers gathered soil, carried it to the building site, laid it down in layers, then compacted it again and again until it formed dense, stable masses. It sounds basic. Dirt is everywhere, but rammed earth is not simply piling up mud. You need to select workable soil. You need to move it in huge quantities. You need to organize workers. You need people preparing material, people hauling baskets, people shaping layers, people compacting surfaces, people maintaining the edges before rain destroys what has just been built. You need a plan that lasts longer than a single season. And you need somebody capable of telling thousands of people where to work. The walls around Liangzhu were immense. Some sections rose several meters high and were built with massive volumes of earth. Moyaoshan required even more. Estimates vary, and archaeologists debate exactly how construction was organized. But the central fact is unavoidable. This was collective labor on a scale far beyond one household, one village, or one spontaneous gathering. A few families could build raised houses. A regional authority could build a city. Imagine the logistics: groups arriving from surrounding settlements during the agricultural off-season, labourers carrying baskets of soil along temporary paths, supervisors marking boundaries, specialists deciding where a wall needed reinforcement, food being gathered, cooked and distributed to keep workers going. Arguments, injuries, rain delays, repairs, the endless physical reality of moving earth, one load at a time, until a wet plain begins to look like a capital. That kind of project does not necessarily prove a single all-powerful ruler. Archaeologists have to be cautious. Large works can be organized through councils, clan alliances, religious obligations, seasonal labor duties, or systems of reciprocal exchange. People may have contributed because they were commanded. They may have contributed because the project protected their fields. They may have believed the work was sacred. Probably the real answer involved some mixture of all three. But whatever the system was, it had reach. It could mobilize labor across a broad area. It could coordinate tasks that took years, perhaps generations. It could maintain shared plans despite floods, changing seasons, and the daily demands of farming. That is what urban planning really reveals. Not just walls and mounds, but relationships between people. The ability of one group to persuade, reward, compel, or inspire many others to act together. And Liangzhu was planned at more than one scale. The inner city protected the ceremonial and political core. The larger outer enclosure created space for a wider population and activities that supported the centre. Raised mounds offered dry ground, ditches and channels helped direct water and movement. Settlements beyond the walls linked the city to the productive countryside that fed it. This was not an isolated monument surrounded by wilderness. It was the hub of a managed landscape. A capital does not survive on ritual alone. It needs grain, labour, craft specialists, traders, fishermen, builders, people tending rice paddies beyond the city, while others shape jade, make pottery, repair embankments, and carry messages through the waterways. Liangzhu's urban form suggests a society in which different communities were being drawn into one larger system. That system was impressive, but it also carried a risk. The more a city depends on raised ground, control channels, walls, embankments, and coordinated labour, the more vulnerable it becomes when the water stops obeying. Liangzhu had built a capital in the wetlands. Next, its people would attempt something even more remarkable. They would try to control the water itself, and this is where Liangzhu becomes almost unbelievable. The city was not just protected by walls, raised platforms and ditches. Northwest of the urban centre, in the hills and low valleys feeding into the plain, archaeologists discovered something far larger, a system of dams. Not one dam, not one convenient embankment thrown across a stream. A connected landscape of artificial barriers, channels and reservoirs built to capture, hold, redirect and possibly release water before it reached the city and its surrounding farmland. Around 5,000 years ago, long before China's first dynasties, long before the Great Wall, long before the famous imperial canal systems that would later link entire regions of the country. Liangzhu was already treating water as something that could be organized. The known waterworks lie northwest of the ancient city, where water flowing down from the surrounding hills entered the lower Yangtze plain. This was exactly the kind of place where seasonal rainfall could become dangerous. Rain falls in the uplands, streams fill quickly, water rushes downhill through narrow valleys. Then it reaches the flat, low-lying wetlands around Liangzhu, where it spreads out, slows down, and can flood everything in its path. For a small village, that is a disaster waiting to happen. For Liangzhu, it may have been an engineering challenge. Archaeologists have identified a series of earthen dams arranged across valleys and lower slopes. Some were large barriers, built high enough to block substantial flows of water. Others were smaller, lower structures placed farther downstream. Together, they appear to have created reservoirs of different sizes at different elevations. Think of it like a giant machine with no metal parts. The hills were the collection area. Rainwater was the fuel. Dams acted as gates. Reservoirs became storage tanks. Channels may have guided water from one place to another. And the city, sitting out on the wet plain, was connected to this entire system downstream. It was not a machine in the modern sense. There were no pumps, gears or valves. But it was still a system designed to make the landscape behave differently. And that is what makes the discovery so striking. Neolithic people are often imagined as farmers living in scattered villages, using simple tools, responding to nature as best they can. Liangzhu does not fit that picture. Here was a society capable of understanding terrain across a wide area. A society that could identify where water gathered, where it moved, where an embankment might hold, and where a reservoir might protect land below. They were not just adapting to wetlands, they were redesigning an entire watershed. Exactly what every part of the system did remains uncertain. That is important. The structures are ancient earthworks, altered by thousands of years of erosion, farming, sediment buildup, and changing watercourses. Archaeologists can map their locations. They can study their construction. They can reconstruct the ancient topography, but they cannot simply read a manual left behind by the engineers. No text tells us, this dam was for irrigation, this channel was for transport. This reservoir was opened in the 5th month after the rains. So researchers have to work from the evidence. One possible purpose was flood control. By holding water in upland reservoirs, the dams may have reduced the speed and force of seasonal runoff. Instead of allowing every heavy rain to surge directly toward the settlement, water could be slowed, stored and released more gradually. In a region where flooding was a permanent threat, that alone would have been transformative. It could mean rice fields surviving a storm season. It could mean roads and embankments remaining passable. It could mean the raised centre of Liangzhu was not constantly surrounded by uncontrolled water. Another possible role was water supply. Stored water could have provided a more reliable source during dry periods, when streams shrank and wetlands changed. The lower Yangtze was wet, but wet does not always mean predictable. Rain falls unevenly. Rivers shift. A summer drought can follow a spring flood. A reservoir system would give communities a buffer, a way to carry water across the gap between seasons. Then there is irrigation. Rice farming depends on water, but not simply on having as much water as possible. Too little can ruin a crop. Too much can destroy it. Fields need water at particular times, in particular amounts. They need drainage as much as they need flooding. Liangzhu's hydraulic system may have helped support the intensive rice agriculture that fed its population, regulating water for paddies spread across the surrounding plain. But this is where caution matters. Some scholars argue that flood management was the main purpose. Others see irrigation and water storage as central. Still others point out that the reservoirs and connected waterways may also have supported transportation. In a wetland society, water was not only a threat or an agricultural resource. It was a road. Boats could move people, timber, stone, food, pottery, and perhaps jade materials through channels far more easily than they could cross muddy ground on foot. A managed water system may have helped link the city to nearby settlements, work sites, and farming zones. It may even have allowed authorities to control movement, access, and trade. Maybe the real answer is not one function. Maybe that is the whole point. The greatest infrastructure projects are rarely built for only one reason. A dam that reduces floods can also store water. A channel that carries irrigation water can also carry boats. A reservoir that protects fields can become a source of fish, reeds, and drinking water. Liangzhu's system may have worked precisely because it turned one unstable landscape into several useful resources at once. But none of this happened by accident. Earth dams sound simple until you consider their scale. To build one, people had to gather enormous amounts of soil. They had to carry it, pile it, compact it, shape slopes that would not immediately collapse, and reinforce the structure against flowing water. They had to understand that water presses harder as it rises. They had to account for seepage, erosion, overflow, and the terrifying possibility that a breach could send stored water rushing downhill. And then they had to do it again, across multiple valleys, over a broad area. The labour requirement must have been immense. Estimates differ because the exact original size and construction sequence of the dams remain debated. But even the most cautious interpretation leads to the same conclusion. This was not the work of a few households responding to a bad season. It required planning, it required labour coordination, it required food supplies for workers, it required people who could decide where a structure should go, when it needed repair, and how different parts of the system connected. Most of all, it required maintenance. A wall can stand for years if nobody touches it. Waterworks cannot. Channels clog, banks erode, reservoirs fill with sediment. Heavy rains cut new paths through earth. Animals burrow into embankments. Roots weaken slopes. Every year somebody had to inspect, repair, dredge, reinforce and rebuild. That means Liangzhu's hydraulic machine was not just a construction project. It was an institution. It demanded recurring cooperation. Seasonal obligations, perhaps work crews drawn from surrounding villages, perhaps officials, ritual leaders, or local elites who organised labour. Perhaps communities contributed because the reservoirs protected their own fields. Perhaps they were compelled by a powerful centre. Perhaps flood control itself became sacred, tied to the legitimacy of the people who claimed to keep chaos away. We cannot know exactly, but we can see the result. Liangzhu was not simply a city beside water. It was a city whose survival may have depended on a vast engineered system beyond its walls. Its power reached into hills, valleys, fields, streams, and reservoirs. The capital was only the visible centre. The real city may have included the entire managed landscape around it. And that created a new kind of wealth, because once you can control water, even imperfectly, you can control something even more valuable. Food, food, that was the real prize. Not jade, not walls, not even the enormous dams in the hills. Rice. In the lower Yangtze, around Liangzhu, water and grain came together in a way that could support far more people than hunting and gathering alone. This was one of the great rice-growing landscapes of ancient East Asia. Flat ground, warm, humid summers, seasonal rains, slow-moving rivers, marshes and shallow lakes. A world that could be dangerous, muddy, insect-filled and unpredictable. But if you knew how to work it, it could also be unbelievably productive. Wet rice cultivation is different from simply scattering seeds across dry ground and waiting for rain. Rice can thrive in flooded fields, but those fields have to be prepared. Land needs to be levelled, banks need to be built, water has to enter, stay long enough, and then drain away when the crop requires it. Seedlings may be raised separately and transplanted. Weeds have to be controlled. Fields need constant attention. It is labour-intensive, but it can produce a remarkable amount of food from a relatively small area. And that changes everything. Archaeologists have found evidence of rice cultivation across the Liangzhu world. Rice grains, husks, and phytoliths, tiny silica structures left behind by plants. They have identified ancient paddy fields and traces of field systems in the broader region. The exact yields are impossible to calculate with certainty. We do not know precisely how much land was cultivated, how crops varied from year to year, or how efficiently every community managed water. But the overall pattern is clear. Liangzhu was not fed by luck. It was supported by an agricultural base strong enough to sustain a large population, build a major centre, and keep enormous numbers of people working on things that did not directly produce food. Think about what that means. A farmer grows enough rice to feed a household. Good. That household survives. But if farmers produce more than their own families need, that surplus can feed other people. Potters, jade carvers, woodworkers, builders, boat makers, ritual specialists, people who organize labour, people who guard storehouses, people who may never plant a single rice seed, but whose work becomes possible because someone else has. This is how a village starts becoming something more. Not overnight, not because one ruler suddenly declares a kingdom. But slowly, season by season, as harvests become more reliable and food can be stored, moved, collected and redistributed. Rice is especially important here because it connects directly to water control. A harvest depends on fields receiving enough water. But too much water at the wrong moment can flatten plants, wash away soil, drown roots, and leave entire paddies buried under sediment. The same reservoirs and channels that may have protected Liangzhu from floods could also have helped stabilize the farming landscape around it. So the dams were not separate from the economy, they were part of the food system. A reservoir upstream might hold back destructive runoff. A channel might carry water toward fields. An embankment might separate one flooded plot from another. A raised route might let people reach farmland during the wet season. Every piece of managed ground increased the chance that a community could turn an unpredictable wetland into dependable calories. And calories are power. But rice was never the only thing people ate. The lower Yangtze was not a simple agricultural plain. It was an ecological jackpot. Rivers, lakes, marshes, forests, hills and tidal environments all lay within reach. Even as rice became central, Liangzhu communities continued to draw food and materials from a wide range of landscapes. Fish were an obvious resource. The waterways were full of them. Archaeological finds include fish remains and tools associated with fishing, while nets, traps, hooks, and boats may have helped communities exploit shallow water and deeper channels. Fish could be eaten fresh, dried, smoked, or perhaps fermented. In a society built around canals and rivers, the water itself was a pantry. Shellfish and freshwater animals added more food. Wetlands offered reeds, aquatic plants, and edible roots. Forests and uplands provided fruits, nuts, timber, fibres, and medicinal plants. Hunting continued too. Deer and other wild animals supplied meat, hides, bone, antler, and materials for tools. Then there were domesticated animals. Pigs appear to have been especially important, as they were across much of Neolithic China. They could be raised close to settlements, fed on scraps and gathered foods, and slaughtered when meat was needed. Dogs were also present, probably serving practical roles in hunting, guarding, and daily life. Other animals may have been used or managed in different ways, but the evidence is not always easy to interpret. Bones can tell us what was eaten. They do not always tell us exactly who owned an animal, how it was cared for, or what meaning it held. Still, the picture is not of people depending on one fragile food source. It is a mixed economy. Rice formed the dependable foundation. Fishing added protein. Hunting and gathering provided flexibility. Pigs turned household waste into meat. Wetlands supplied materials that fields could not. Forests buffered bad harvests. Rivers connected all of it. That diversity mattered because wetlands are generous, but they are never safe. A wetland can feed you in a dozen different ways. It can also destroy a season in a single storm. Floodwater can breach field banks. Standing water can spread disease. Changes in a river channel can cut off a settlement from a fishing ground or turn productive land into marsh. Drought can be just as dangerous. Rice fields may look permanently wet, but they still depend on timing. Too little rain or water arriving at the wrong stage of growth could turn abundance into scarcity. And then there was the larger problem. The lower Yangtze plain was not fixed. Rivers moved, sediment accumulated, lakes expanded and contracted. Sea levels and coastal conditions shifted over long periods. A village that sat beside a useful channel could find itself stranded from it generations later. A carefully managed field system could be overwhelmed by conditions beyond anyone's control. Liangzhu's people understood enough to push back against that instability. Their waterworks show that clearly, but they could not eliminate it. They were not masters of nature in the modern sense. They were negotiators with a landscape that could reward them spectacularly or punish them without warning. Still, for a time, the negotiation worked. Rice harvests helped support dense populations. Dense populations provided labour. Labour built dams, raised platforms, dug ditches and maintained channels. Those projects made agriculture more secure, at least in some places and some years. More secure agriculture generated more surplus. More surplus supported specialists, elites, ceremonies, workshops and trade. It is a feedback loop. Food creates organisation. Organisation creates more food. And eventually organisation creates a society so complex that it needs leaders, institutions, symbols, rules and systems for deciding who receives what. The rivers made that process even more powerful. In much of the ancient world, moving heavy goods overland was painfully slow. A person can carry only so much. An ox cart needs roads. But a boat can carry huge loads with relatively little effort, especially on calm rivers and canals. For Liangzhu, waterways may have functioned like highways. Rice could move from farming villages toward the centre. Fish, pigs, timber, pottery, and reeds could travel between settlements. Workers could be transported to construction sites. Jade raw materials from distant sources could pass through networks of rivers and coastal routes. Finished goods could travel back out. So could people. A farmer visiting kin, a craft specialist seeking work, a marriage partner moving to another community, a ritual leader carrying authority, traders bringing unfamiliar stones, new techniques, and stories from places beyond the horizon. Ideas move fastest when people can move, and in the lower Yangtze, water gave people a way to do that. This is why Liangzhu should not be imagined as one isolated city rising out of the mud. It was the centre of a living network. Fields fed waterways. Waterways linked villages. Villages supplied labour and goods. The capital concentrated wealth, labour and ritual power. Then its influence flowed back outward through the same rivers that carried food into its storehouses. The wetland did not merely surround Liangzhu, it made Liangzhu possible, but it also created a dangerous dependency. The more people relied on managed water, controlled fields and river connections, the more vulnerable they became when that system failed. And at Liangzhu, wealth was not measured only in full granaries. It was also measured in something harder to grow, harder to acquire, and far more difficult to explain. Jade, jade. For Liangzhu, it was more than a beautiful stone. It was labour made visible, wealth made permanent, power that could be held in the hand, worn on the body, buried with the dead, and perhaps carried into whatever came after death. The people of Liangzhu did not simply find jade, chip it into shape, and admire the result. Jade does not work that way. Most of the jade used in ancient China was nephrite, a dense interlocking mineral material, usually pale green, grey, white, yellowish or dark green. It is not necessarily the brightest gem in the world. Raw jade can look surprisingly ordinary, like a dull stone pulled from a riverbed. But it is incredibly tough, not just hard in the simple sense, but resistant to breaking and shaping. A metal blade cannot easily carve it, and Liangzhu existed thousands of years before iron tools, before bronze was widely used in this region, before machines, electric drills, or precision-cutting wheels. So, how do you turn a hard lump of nephrite into a polished ceremonial object with straight edges, perfectly drilled holes, delicate incised lines, and complex geometric forms? Very slowly, jade workers likely used abrasion. Sand rich in quartz mixed with water could grind away at the surface over time. Sawing may have involved cords or thin tools used with abrasive grit. Holes could be drilled with hollow tubes, probably made from bamboo, bone, wood or other materials, again using sand as the real cutting agent. Then came polishing. More grinding, more rubbing, more hours. Maybe days for a simple item. Weeks, months, perhaps far longer for the most elaborate pieces. Think about that for a moment. Every jade object represented somebody's time. Not casual spare time either. Skilled, specialized labor. A person had to understand the stone, choose the right material, avoid cracks, shape it without ruining it, and produce an object that matched a recognized ritual design. And while that craftsperson worked, someone else had to grow the rice. That is why jade matters. It tells us Liangzhu had enough surplus, enough organization and enough control over labor to support people making objects that were not necessary for basic survival. You cannot eat jade. You cannot plant it. It will not hold back floodwater or fill a granary. But a society can decide that some things are worth more than food, especially when those things help explain who has authority, who belongs, and who does not. The most famous Liangzhu jade objects are called kong. A kong is one of the strangest and most distinctive ritual forms in early Chinese archaeology. It is a tube, usually circular on the inside, but squared on the outside. Imagine taking a round pipe and enclosing it inside a rectangular block. Some are small enough to hold easily, others are large, heavy, and astonishingly refined. Why make a shape like that? Nobody knows for certain. Later Chinese traditions sometimes associated round forms with heaven and square forms with earth. That interpretation is tempting, especially because Liangzhu also produced jade discs called bai, thin circular rings with a hole in the centre. But Liangzhu existed more than 4,000 years ago. We cannot simply assume that ideas recorded much later meant exactly the same thing to these people. Still, the contrast is hard to ignore. Round discs, square tubes, carefully repeated forms, objects placed in graves with a precision that suggests they were part of a shared ceremonial language. The people who made and used them knew what they meant. We are the ones left trying to translate a message without its words. Liangzhu jade workers also produced axes, including broad ceremonial blades, often called yue. Some may have been based on practical tools, but many were far too finely made, too carefully polished, or too symbolically charged to be ordinary working axes. They were not meant for clearing trees every morning. They may have represented the right to command. In many early societies, weapons and tools become symbols of authority. A blade can cut wood, it can kill animals, it can threaten enemies. But in the hands of an elite, it can become something else. Proof that this person has the power to organize force, punish rivals, lead warriors, or direct labor. At Liangzhu, jade axes may have done exactly that. There were also bracelets, pendants, beads, rings, and smaller ornaments. Some were worn in life. Some were likely made specifically for ritual. Some may have passed through generations carried as inherited objects, linking the living to ancestors whose names are now gone. Then came death. This is where the difference between people becomes impossible to ignore. Some Liangzhu burials contain extraordinary collections of jade, kong tubes, bai discs, axes, bracelets, pendants, dozens, even scores of carefully made objects placed around a single body. The dead may be laid out with jade near the head, chest, arms, waist, or feet, arranged in ways that appear deliberate rather than random. These were not simply people being buried with their favourite possessions. The scale of the investment is too great. A tomb filled with jade represents access to rare materials, skilled specialists, food surplus, trade connections, and the authority to remove all of those valuable objects from circulation and place them permanently in the ground. That is a political statement. It says this person mattered. Maybe they were a ruler, maybe a ritual leader, maybe the head of a powerful lineage. Maybe several of those roles were combined in one individual. We do not have written titles. We cannot point to an inscription and say, this was the king, this was the priest, this was the general. But the graves make one thing clear. Liangzhu was not socially equal. Many people were buried with few goods, modest goods, or no jade at all. Their lives were still essential. They farmed rice, caught fish, raised pigs, cut timber, made pottery, dug canals, carried earth, and built the world the elite lived in. But they did not all receive the same treatment in death. And that difference was probably not accidental. Jade may have marked rank in life and status in the afterlife. It may have been believed to protect the dead, connect them to ancestors, or help them communicate with powerful forces beyond the human world. It may have served as a sacred material precisely because it was difficult to obtain and almost impossible to destroy. Food rots, wood decays, cloth vanishes, bodies return to earth. Jade remains. That durability may have made it the perfect material for a society thinking about ancestry, legitimacy, and power across generations. If your authority came from the past, if you claimed descent from powerful forebears, then jade was a way to make that connection physically real. A polished object older than any living person, passed from one elite generation to the next. A symbol that said, "We were here before you. We will remain after you." But jade at Liangzhu was not only smooth and silent. Some of the most important pieces carried images, tiny faces, mask-like forms, eyes staring out from the corners of Kong tubes, and those faces may bring us closer than anything else to the beliefs of this vanished civilization. Look closely at one of these Kong tubes and you may see the same image again and again. A face, not a naturalistic portrait, not a smiling human figure with a recognizable name. It is compressed, geometric, almost abstract, but once you recognize it, it is difficult to unsee. Two large circular eyes stare outward. Above them may be a human-like head, sometimes with a headdress or crown-like shape. Below, or merged into it, is another face, broader, more animal-like, with rounded eyes, a flattened snout, and what may be fangs. Human above, beast below, or perhaps human and beast fused into one being. This is the most famous image in Liangzhu art. It appears on jade Kong, especially on the corners, arranged in horizontal bands. It appears on other prestigious objects too. Sometimes the carving is so fine that it can barely be seen without close inspection. Sometimes centuries of burial have softened the lines. But the pattern survives. A pair of staring eyes, a human-like figure, an animal presence beneath it, and a question that has haunted archaeologists for decades. What were they looking at? The first possibility is that this was a god. Many early societies represented supernatural beings as combinations of human and animal traits. A creature with a human face and animal power is not necessarily a monster. It may be something more dangerous and more sacred than either. A being that belongs in the boundary between worlds, part human, part wild, part ancestral, part divine. For people living in the wetlands of the lower Yangtze, that boundary may have felt very real. Their world was full of water, mist, dangerous animals, seasonal floods and landscapes that could change shape with a single storm. The rivers brought rice, fish, transport and wealth. But they could also bring destruction. In that kind of world, powerful spirits would not have been an abstract idea. They may have been understood as forces woven directly into the landscape. A face on a jade object could have been a way of addressing those forces, or protecting against them. But there is another possibility. Maybe the figure was not a god at all. Maybe it was an ancestor. Liangzhu elites placed jade in graves with remarkable care. Some of these objects may have been heirlooms, passed through generations before finally being buried with a powerful person. If so, the face may have represented the presence of the dead, ancestors watching over their descendants, authorizing the living, reminding everyone that authority did not begin with the person currently holding it. It came from before, in a society without written records. Ancestry could be more than family memory. It could be political technology. If one lineage could claim a special connection to revered ancestors, then it could claim a special right to lead, to direct labor, to control ritual, to organize the movement of food, jade, and people. The face in the jade may have said something simple but powerful. We are not ordinary. We carry the authority of those who came before. Then there is a third interpretation, and it may be the most intriguing of all. What if the image shows a shaman? In many cultures, ritual specialists are imagined crossing the line between human life and the spirit world. They may wear animal skins, feathers, masks, or antlers. They may enter trances. They may be seen as taking on animal qualities in order to communicate with beings that ordinary people cannot reach. The Liangzhu motif may show exactly this kind of transformation. The upper face looks more human, the lower one looks more animal. Perhaps the image is not two separate beings stacked together. Perhaps it is one person becoming something else, a ritual leader taking on the power of an animal spirit, a human mediator standing between the village and the unseen world. It is a compelling idea, but compelling is not the same as proven, and this is where Liangzhu becomes frustrating. The people who made these objects left no writing that we can read, no king's name beside the face, no temple inscription explaining the ritual, no surviving myth that tells us, this is the god of the river, this is the first ancestor, this is the mask worn during harvest ceremonies. We have the image, we have the graves, we have the massive waterworks, the rice fields, the elite compounds, and the enormous investment in jade. But we do not have the words, so every interpretation has limits. Maybe the motif represented a deity, maybe a powerful animal spirit, maybe a clan ancestor, maybe a shaman. Maybe it carried several meanings at once, depending on who used it and in what ceremony. Symbols often work that way. A modern flag is cloth, colour, history, sacrifice, identity, and political power all at the same time. The people who recognise it do not need a written explanation. They already know. That may be what mattered most about the Liangzhu face. It was repeated. Not once, not casually, but across some of the most labour-intensive and prestigious objects in the entire society. The same staring eyes appear on jade that required immense skill to produce. Jade placed in the richest graves, jade associated with people who had access to wealth, ritual, and probably authority. That repetition suggests a shared visual language. Imagine living in a settlement connected by canals to other settlements across the delta. You may never meet the people in every community. You may speak slightly differently. Your local leaders may compete. Your village may have its own ancestors and customs. But then you see the same face, on the jade of a powerful burial, on the ceremonial object held by a leader, on an artifact carried from a distant centre through networks of exchange and obligation. The image tells you that the people using it belong to the same sacred order. That is how ideology works before books, laws, and official seals. It can be built into objects, into burial rituals, into repeated shapes and images that teach people, without ever needing to explain themselves, who has access to the supernatural and who has the right to rule. The face in the jade may not tell us the name of Liangzhu's gods, but it may reveal something just as important. Someone controlled the symbols. And in Liangzhu, control over symbols was probably inseparable from control over society itself. If someone controlled the symbols, then the next question is obvious. Who were they? Archaeology cannot give us their names. It cannot tell us whether Liangzhu had a king, a queen, a council of nobles, or a sacred lineage whose leaders claimed to speak for the ancestors. But it can show us something almost as revealing. It can show us where people were buried, and what was buried with them. At Liangzhu cemeteries, the dead were not treated equally. Some graves are modest, a body, a few pottery vessels, maybe a simple tool. These were people whose lives mattered to their families and communities, of course. But in the archaeological record, they leave little material wealth behind. Then there are the elite burials. These graves can contain dozens, sometimes hundreds of jade objects. Kong tubes, discs, axes, beads, pendants, finely worked ornaments. Objects made from materials that had to be acquired, shaped, polished, and preserved through an enormous investment of human labour. The contrast is difficult to ignore. One person is buried with almost nothing. Another goes into the ground surrounded by a fortune. And jade was not like a pile of grain or a basket of fish. It could not simply be gathered from the nearest field. It had to come from distant sources. It had to be transported across rivers, wetlands, and mountain routes. Then skilled craftspeople had to grind it into shape using abrasives, water, and astonishing patience. There were no metal drills, no electric tools, just stone, sand, labour, and time. To make a single large jade Kong may have required months, possibly longer. To place dozens of such objects in one grave was to make a statement that everyone watching would understand. This person was not ordinary, but was that status earned in life? Was it inherited at birth, or both? That is one of the biggest debates surrounding Liangzhu society. Some of the richest burials appear to belong to adults who may have held major authority during their lifetimes. Their jade, their ceremonial axes, and their prominent placement suggest people who had power. Perhaps they organized rituals, perhaps they commanded labor, perhaps they controlled access to land, water, trade goods, and sacred objects. But other evidence raises a more troubling possibility. If high-status individuals were buried in ways that consistently marked them as members of a privileged group, then Liangzhu may not have simply had respected leaders. It may have had entrenched rank, families or lineages whose position was passed down through generations. A hereditary elite. Think about what that means. You are born into one household, and your future is rice farming, fishing, hauling earth, repairing dikes, raising children, and contributing labour when the community calls. You are born into another, and your future may include jade ornaments, ritual authority, access to distant trade networks, and a burial designed to preserve your status forever. That kind of division is not just wealth inequality. It is a different way of organising human life. And Liangzhu had projects that seemed to require exactly that kind of organisation. The enormous earthen dams, reservoirs, canals, platforms and settlement walls around the Liangzhu centre did not build themselves. Moving earth on that scale means thousands of people carrying baskets, cutting turf, shaping embankments, maintaining water channels, and working through seasons when they might otherwise be tending crops. Someone had to decide where the work would happen. Someone had to gather the labourers. Someone had to supply food while they worked. Someone had to settle disputes, enforce obligations, and make sure one community's canal did not destroy another community's fields. That does not automatically prove a centralised state. Communities can cooperate. People can organise seasonal labour through kinship, ritual obligation, or mutual necessity. A flood-prone wetland gives everyone a reason to work together. But the scale and coordination at Liangzhu suggests something more than a loose collection of independent villages. It suggests hierarchy. At the bottom were probably the farmers whose rice fields generated the surplus that made everything else possible. Rice was wealth, but it was also labour. Planting, weeding, harvesting, threshing, storing. Year after year, the lower Yangtze could be extraordinarily productive, yet that productivity depended on constant work and careful water management. There were fishers too, moving through rivers and marshes, bringing in aquatic resources from a landscape that was never just farmland. There were builders, people who knew how wet soil behaved, how to raise platforms above flood levels, how to channel water without letting it break through an embankment. There were craft specialists, potters, woodworkers, stone workers, and above all jade workers whose skill transformed hard green stone into objects carrying political and ritual meaning. Not everyone needed to be a jade specialist. In fact, most people probably were not. But the existence of such refined craft production implies that some people could spend long periods doing work other than producing their own food. That means someone, somewhere, was supporting them. Surplus was being collected, labour was being directed, and prestige goods were being distributed selectively. Then there were the ritual authorities. Maybe they were the same people as the political leaders. Maybe they came from the same elite lineages, or maybe Liangzhu divided authority more carefully. One group managing water and labour, another conducting ceremonies, another controlling jade production and exchange. We cannot know the exact arrangement, but in early complex societies, power often works best when it wears a sacred mask. A leader who merely demands labour can be resisted. A leader who claims to maintain harmony between ancestors, rivers, crops and the living carries a different kind of authority. Refusing them may not feel like refusing a person. It may feel like risking the entire world. That may explain why jade mattered so much. It was beautiful, yes, rare, certainly. But it may also have been proof that a particular group stood closer to the sacred order, represented by those staring faces. Elite control over jade could have been elite control over legitimacy itself. So what was Liangzhu? Was it a state? Some scholars argue that its vast population centre, monumental hydraulic works, social hierarchy, specialised craft production, and regional influence make it one of East Asia's earliest states. By that definition, Liangzhu was already doing many things later states would do, mobilising labour, managing landscapes, concentrating wealth, and projecting authority over a wide area. Others are more cautious. They see Liangzhu as a powerful chiefdom or a network of competing regional centres held together by ritual trade and elite alliances rather than a fully bureaucratic government. There is no readable writing, no clear palace archives, no surviving tax records, no list of officials, no document saying who ruled whom, and that absence matters. Maybe Liangzhu was not one unified kingdom at all. Maybe it was a complex regional polity, a sacred capital surrounded by allied settlements, local leaders, farming communities, and exchange networks, all tied together by water management and shared ritual symbols. Modern labels can help us ask questions. State, chiefdom, kingdom, civilization. But they can also mislead us. The people of Liangzhu did not call themselves any of those things. They had their own words, their own titles, their own ideas about rank and obligation. Those words are gone. What remains is the pattern. Rich graves and poor graves, jade in the hands of a few. Monumental works built by many. A society where status was not hidden. It was carved into stone, buried with the dead, and raised in earth above the wetlands. And once a society creates that kind of hierarchy, it does not stay isolated for long. Its rulers need jade, its craftspeople need raw materials. Its farmers need tools, its elites need rare goods that prove their power reaches farther than the horizon. Long before the Silk Road, Liangzhu was already connected to a much larger world. But what did connected actually mean? It is easy to imagine ancient exchange as a neat line on a map. Goods leaving one capital, moving along a route, arriving at another. But the world of Liangzhu was not organised like a modern trading system. There were no passports, no customs posts, no merchants carrying invoices from one kingdom to another. There were rivers, there were boats, there were coastal waterways, mountain passes, marriage alliances, seasonal gatherings, ritual exchanges, and long chains of people passing rare materials from hand to hand. And through those networks, Liangzhu's influence travelled astonishingly far. The most obvious evidence is jade. Liangzhu craftspeople developed a visual language so distinctive that archaeologists can recognise it immediately. The square Kong tubes, the circular bai discs, the carefully shaped ceremonial axes, and above all, those strange faces, round eyes, prominent noses, elaborate headgear, sometimes combining human and animal features into something that still feels powerful more than 5,000 years later. Objects in this style, or objects clearly inspired by it, have been found well beyond Liangzhu's lower Yangtze heartland. They appear in regions connected to the Yellow River basin to the north. They appear along the southeast coast. They appear inland, far from the wetland capital where this jade tradition reached its most elaborate form. Sometimes the objects may have been made in Liangzhu workshops and carried outward. Sometimes local craftspeople may have copied a prestigious foreign style using their own materials and techniques. Either way, the message is the same. People far beyond Liangzhu knew what this jade meant. That does not necessarily mean they obeyed Liangzhu. It means Liangzhu mattered. This distinction is crucial because dramatic headlines often make an even bigger claim. They say Liangzhu ruled Asia before China's first dynasty. It is a powerful phrase. It is also almost certainly too simple. Asia is enormous. Even Eastern Asia contained many different cultures, communities, and regional centres during Liangzhu's time. There is no evidence that rulers in the lower Yangtze commanded every village, controlled every distant territory, or maintained an empire stretching across the continent. No army lists survive, no conquered provinces are named. No written orders tell local governors what to do. But political power is not the only kind of power. A society can influence distant people without governing them. It can make an object so desirable that elites hundreds of miles away want one. It can create rituals that others adopt. It can control access to materials that make local leaders look important. It can become the place where rare goods, specialist knowledge, and sacred symbols come together. Think of it like a modern luxury brand, except the product is not a handbag or a watch. It is a jade object that may tell everyone at a funeral, a feast, or a ceremony that the person holding it has connections reaching beyond their own valley. For a local leader, that connection could be politically useful. If you can display a rare Liangzhu-style Kong or bury a relative with one, you're not just showing wealth. You are showing access. You are saying, my household has ties to the larger world, and in a world of small communities and competing lineages, that could change everything. The lower Yangtze was ideally placed for this kind of exchange. Liangzhu stood in a landscape already threaded by water. Rivers, lakes, marsh channels, and the coast created natural corridors. A boat loaded with rice, timber, pottery, fish products, stone, or jade could move far more efficiently than people carrying the same weight overland. To the north lay routes linking the Yangtze world with societies around the Yellow River. These were not empty spaces between civilizations. They were inhabited landscapes, full of communities with their own traditions, their own elite burials, their own sacred objects, and their own ambitions. To the southeast, coastal routes opened connections with communities along what is now Fujian and farther down the shore. Inland routes followed river valleys toward upland regions where different resources could be obtained. One community had access to salt, another to high-quality stone, another to timber, pigment, animal products, shells, or ores. Nobody needed to control the entire route for exchange to happen. A valuable object could travel hundreds of miles through a chain of local relationships. This is where the raw materials become especially revealing. Jade itself was not simply sitting beside every Liangzhu workshop. The nephrite used for these objects had to come from suitable geological sources, and identifying the exact origin of every piece remains difficult. Researchers have proposed different source areas, and the evidence is still being refined. But the basic fact is clear. Liangzhu's jade industry depended on access to stone beyond the immediate needs of a farming village. The same is true of other materials. Fine stone tools, unusual minerals, shells, and prestige goods did not all originate in one place. Their movement shows that Liangzhu was part of a larger economic world. Not an economy of coins and markets in the modern sense, but a system of exchange, where materials, finished objects, labour, obligation and status all move together. But what kind of exchange? That question is harder than it sounds. Some goods may have been traded directly. One community provides jade or crafted ornaments, another offers food, stone, timber, salt, or other valued resources. Some may have moved as gifts. A marriage alliance between elite families could bring prestigious objects into a new region. A ceremonial gathering could involve feasting, reciprocal generosity, and the exchange of rare items meant to create lasting obligations. Some may have been tribute, if Liangzhu's central elite held power over nearby communities. Those communities may have sent goods toward the capital as a sign of allegiance, payment, or ritual duty. And some movement may reflect cultural influence alone. A local leader might commission a Liangzhu-style object without ever meeting anyone from Liangzhu. Ideas can travel through imitation. A symbol seen once at a gathering can be copied for generations. Military control is also possible in some places, at some times. Powerful societies often use force, but archaeology must be careful here. Finding Liangzhu-style jade in a distant grave does not prove that Liangzhu soldiers marched there. A prestige object is not a conquest map. In fact, the farther an influence travels, the less likely it is that one simple explanation fits every case. Near the Liangzhu center, exchange may have been shaped by direct political authority, labor obligations, and control of waterways. Farther away, the same jade forms may have moved through alliances between regional elites. Farther still, they may have become symbols detached from Liangzhu itself, copied because they carried an aura of ancient power. That is how influence expands beyond borders, not always through armies, sometimes through objects, sometimes through rituals, sometimes through the quiet but irresistible desire to possess what powerful people possess. And that raises another mystery. If Liangzhu's symbols could travel so far without readable writing, how were their meanings preserved? How did people know what a kong, a Bai disc, or a staring jade face was supposed to communicate? Maybe they did not need words carved into stone. Maybe the symbols themselves were already doing the work of writing. Maybe the symbols themselves were already doing the work of writing. It is an exciting idea, but it comes with a problem. A symbol is not automatically writing. Humans have used symbols for tens of thousands of years. A painted handprint in a cave is a symbol. A clan mark scratched onto a pot is a symbol. A jade face with staring eyes and an elaborate crown is definitely a symbol. It may represent a deity, an ancestor, a ruler, a ritual guardian, or an idea that has vanished from human memory. But writing is something more specific. A true writing system does not just create an image or announce status. It records language. It lets people preserve names, agreements, inventories, prayers, laws, stories, commands. It allows a message to survive after the speaker is dead, and after everyone who heard the original words has forgotten them. And that is the line Liangzhu has not yet crossed, at least not in the evidence we have found. Archaeologists have discovered marks on some Liangzhu objects, especially pottery. There are incised signs, repeated strokes, simple geometric forms and marks that may have identified households, workshops, ownership, batches of goods or ritual use. A potter may have marked a vessel before firing it. A community may have used a familiar sign to identify a lineage. An administrator may have tracked stored grain, labour, or offerings with a system that made perfect sense to the people using it. But we do not know that uncertainty matters. A few repeated marks can look tantalizingly close to writing. And sometimes they may have been part of an administrative system. Liangzhu was large enough, organized enough, and economically complex enough that its leaders probably needed ways to track people, materials, food, labor, and ritual obligations. You do not build huge water control systems, manage rice production, and mobilize specialized jade workers through pure improvisation. Some kind of information system almost certainly existed. But an information system is not necessarily writing. You can organize a society with memory, oral rules, tally objects, knotted cords, marked tokens, standardized containers, ritual calendars, and specialists whose job is to remember what everyone owes. You can use colors, shapes, seals, gestures, and objects that carry shared meanings. None of those things has to encode spoken words. Think about the Jade Kong. Its form was highly standardized, square outside, circular inside. Its carved face appeared again and again, with enough consistency that people across a broad region could recognize it. That consistency suggests shared rules. Someone knew what counted as a proper Kong. Someone knew which faces belonged on which objects. Someone knew who was allowed to possess them, bury them, offer them, or display them. But the Kong does not tell us its own name. It does not tell us who commissioned it. It does not say which ancestor received it, what ceremony it served, or what promise may have been made when it changed hands. It communicates power. It communicates sacred authority. It may communicate membership in a political and ritual world centered on Liangzhu. But that is not the same thing as a sentence. The same is true of Liangzhu's famous masks or faces. To modern eyes, they can feel almost like a script, a repeated visual code, staring out from jade objects across more than 5,000 years. Yet decorative motifs, even deeply meaningful ones, do not become writing simply because they repeat. For writing, researchers would expect something more. A larger set of signs, signs combined in changing sequences. Patterns that appear in different contexts, evidence that the signs could represent names, words, sounds, or grammatical ideas rather than just one repeated image. So far, Liangzhu has not given us that evidence, and without it, the civilization remains frustratingly silent. Not empty, not simple, silent. Its people speak through what they built. They speak through the scale of their settlement, through walls and moats, raised platforms and canals. They speak through reservoirs and dams built into a wetland landscape. They speak through elite graves stocked with jade, while other burials contain far less. They speak through rice fields, tools, pottery, workshops, and the immense labour required to make a capital function. Every one of those things is evidence. A tomb can reveal inequality without naming a king. A jade workshop can reveal specialist labour without listing wages. A canal can reveal planning without preserving a blueprint. The city's layout can show that someone had authority, engineering knowledge, and the ability to direct thousands of people toward a shared project. But archaeology has limits. Objects can show us what people did. They are much less reliable at telling us what people thought they were doing. Did Liangzhu's rulers claim divine descent? Did they govern through kinship, religion, force, or all three? Did farmers see the hydraulic system as a practical defense against floods, a sacred transformation of the landscape, or both? Did the great jade face represent a god, a masked ritual specialist, an ancestral founder, or a symbol whose meaning changed from place to place? Without readable texts, every answer remains a reconstruction. And then more than 1,000 years after Liangzhu disappeared, writing enters the record in a form no one can mistake. At Shang Dynasty sites, especially at Anyang, archaeologists found oracle bones, animal bones and turtle shells inscribed with Chinese characters. These inscriptions record divinations about harvests, weather, warfare, childbirth, sacrifices, hunts, royal ancestors, and the concerns of kings. They contain names, dates, questions, sometimes even the outcome of events. For the first time, ancient China begins to speak in its own surviving words. The contrast is almost painful. Liangzhu was older by roughly a millennium. It had monumental construction, complex ritual life, elite power, long-distance exchange, and sophisticated environmental engineering. Yet it left no readable archive comparable to the Shang oracle bones. No royal genealogy, no list of canal workers, no record of a flood. No explanation for why Jade mattered so much. Maybe such records never existed. Maybe Liangzhu relied on oral memory and visual symbols rather than writing. Or maybe it did use perishable materials, bamboo, wood, cloth, leather, or painted surfaces that dissolved in the wet soil and vanished long ago. If so, the words are gone forever. And that may be the deepest mystery of Liangzhu. Not simply that a powerful civilization rose before China's first dynasties, but that it may have possessed stories, names, songs, laws, arguments, and memories we will never recover. A whole civilization may once have explained itself. Now we are left reading its silence, and beyond that silence, other societies across East Asia were building their own worlds, their own symbols, and their own paths toward complexity. Liangzhu was not alone. While its people were raising earthen walls above the wetlands of the lower Yangtze, shaping jade into ritual objects and directing water through an engineered landscape, other complex societies were emerging across East Asia. Far to the north, beyond the Yellow River and into the lands of modern northeastern China, the Hongshan culture had already created its own strange and powerful ritual world. Hongshan communities built ceremonial centers on hillsides. They made jade ornaments, including some of the earliest known jade dragons. They constructed platforms, altars, and temple-like structures in landscapes that may have been chosen for their spiritual importance. Hongshan jade was not Liangzhu jade. The materials could come from distant places. The objects could carry prestige. Both societies may have used jade to connect elite power with the sacred world. But the styles were different. The ritual settings were different. The social worlds behind them were different. Hongshan's famous carved dragons twist and coil with animal energy. Liangzhu's jade Kong are rigid, geometric, controlled, square on the outside, round within, covered with staring faces that seem part human, part beast, part something else entirely. Same material, different language of power, and that is the first mistake people make when they imagine ancient China. They look backward from later dynasties, from emperors and capitals, and a written tradition stretching across thousands of years, and assume there must have been one original centre from which everything spread. But there was no single ancient China waiting to be born. There were many worlds in the Shandong region between the Yellow River and the sea. The Duenko culture developed its own farming communities, cemeteries, pottery traditions, and social distinctions. Some Duenko burials contained far more goods than others. Pottery, ornaments, tools, objects placed with the dead in ways that suggest status was becoming increasingly important. But their symbols were not Liangzhu's symbols, their settlement patterns were not Liangzhu's settlement patterns, and their relationship with the landscape was shaped by a different environment. The lower Yangtze was a world of wetlands, lakes, rivers, seasonal rains and rice. The Yellow River Basin was often a world of lower soils, millet farming, shifting river channels, drier seasons, and settlements built around very different ecological rhythms. That difference mattered. Rice does not organize life in exactly the same way as millet. Wetland farming requires knowledge of water, drainage, embankments, timing, and labor coordination. Millet can thrive in drier conditions, but it depends on other strategies, managing soil, rainfall, storage, and the risks of drought. Neither way of life was simple, neither automatically produced states or kings. But each created different pressures, different opportunities, and different ways for communities to grow. In the middle Yangtze region, the Shijiahe culture built large settlements surrounded by moats and defensive earthworks. Some sites became enormous by the standards of their time, suggesting dense populations and serious coordination. Shijiahe communities farmed rice, worked with pottery and other crafts, and occupied a landscape that linked the Yangtze lowlands with routes leading north, south, and west. Then there were the Longshan cultures of the Yellow River world. By around 3000 BC, as Liangzhu was reaching its height, Longshan communities were building walled settlements, producing incredibly thin black pottery, expanding craft specialization, and developing sharper signs of hierarchy and conflict. Some Longshan sites show fortifications, some show evidence of social competition. Some seem connected to the long process that would eventually produce the first Bronze Age states in the Yellow River Basin. But Longshan is not the name of one unified kingdom. It is an archaeological label for a broad family of related regional traditions. Different communities made similar kinds of pottery. They shared some technologies and cultural connections, but they were not necessarily ruled by one center, speaking one language, obeying one authority. That pattern appears everywhere in prehistoric East Asia. Shared ideas, shared materials, shared trade routes, but also local identities. A jade object could travel hundreds of miles without bringing political unity with it. A pottery style could spread through imitation, marriage, exchange, or migration. Farmers could adopt a new crop without abandoning their ancestors, their rituals, or their own leaders. So, were these societies connected? Absolutely. But connected does not mean united. The Yangtze and Yellow River worlds exchanged more than goods. They exchanged techniques, styles, crops, and probably people. Jade moved across enormous distances. Prestige objects carried visual ideas from one elite network to another. Rice cultivation gradually spread northward into areas where millet had long dominated. Millet also moved south into regions where rice was central. Pottery forms changed. Burial customs shifted. Settlement defences appeared in multiple regions. Ideas were moving. People were watching each other. Sometimes they were trading, sometimes marrying, sometimes migrating into new lands, sometimes competing for the same resources, and perhaps occasionally fighting. The archaeological record cannot give us a simple map with neat borders and arrows. It cannot tell us exactly who spoke what language or which community considered another community an ally. But it shows a vast zone of interaction stretching across river valleys, mountain corridors, coastal plains, and inland basins. Liangzhu was one of the most spectacular centers in that network. Not the only one. That changes the meaning of its rise. If Chinese civilization began in one place with one people, one culture, and one unbroken line of progress, then Liangzhu becomes a puzzle. It appears too early, too sophisticated, too far south, too different from the later dynastic centers usually associated with the Yellow River. But if later Chinese civilization emerged from multiple connected traditions, Liangzhu makes much more sense. It was not an accident outside the story. It was one branch of the story. Hongshan contributed a northern tradition of jade and ritual landscapes. Duwenko revealed growing social inequality and regional exchange in the east. Shijiahe showed that large, organized rice farming societies could flourish in the middle Yangtze. Longshan communities developed walled settlements, specialized crafts, and new forms of competition across the Yellow River Basin. And Liangzhu showed what could happen when rice wealth, ritual authority, elite jade, and hydraulic engineering came together in the wetlands of the lower Yangtze. Later China would not simply inherit one of these worlds intact. It would emerge through their interactions, their rivalries, their migrations, their shared technologies, and their surviving memories. But that also means Liangzhu's disappearance was not happening at the edge of history. It happened in the middle of a crowded and changing world. And long before the city fell silent, the landscape itself may have been sending warnings. The warnings did not come from an invading army. They came from the sky, the rivers, and the ground beneath Liangzhu itself. For a city built in low wetlands, water was everything. Water grew the rice, water carried people and goods. Water filled the canals, fed the reservoirs, and linked scattered settlements into one organized world. Liangzhu had become powerful because its people understood how to control water. But control is not the same thing as safety. The lower Yangtze is a landscape shaped by monsoon rains, shifting channels, rising lakes and floodplains that can change course over a human lifetime. A river that brings fertile silt one year can break through an embankment the next. Weeks of unusually heavy rain can turn carefully managed fields into shallow inland seas. And there are signs that Liangzhu's final centuries may have been unusually wet. Cave formations from the broader region, including stalagmites that preserve chemical traces of ancient rainfall, suggest major shifts in monsoon intensity around the time Liangzhu declined. Other paleoclimate records from lake sediments, pollen, and environmental deposits point toward a period of unstable conditions. Not necessarily non-stop rain everywhere. Climate never works that neatly. But stronger monsoons, more extreme storms, and repeated flooding become increasingly plausible. Then there is the sediment. Across parts of the lower Yangtze plain, archaeologists have found layers of silt and flood-borne material associated with the end of Liangzhu occupation. In some places, settlements seem to have been buried, abandoned, or transformed as water reshaped the landscape. But this is where the mystery gets difficult. A wet signal in a cave does not prove one storm destroyed one city. A flood layer near a village does not automatically explain the fall of an entire civilization. Dates have margins of error. Rivers flood locally. Communities can survive disasters that look catastrophic in the ground. Still, the pattern is hard to ignore. Liangzhu had built a hydraulic machine on an enormous scale. Dams, canals, reservoirs, levees, rice fields, settlements, all depending on water moving in predictable ways. So what happened when the water stopped being predictable? What if the system designed to master the wetlands became overwhelmed by them? That is the Great Flood theory. Not necessarily one single wall of water crashing through Liangzhu in a single night, wiping out every temple, palace, and village before dawn. That version makes for a powerful story. It is also more certainty than the evidence can give us. The more likely scenario may have been slower, messier, and in some ways even more destructive. Imagine the monsoon becoming stronger year after year. Not one impossible storm, but repeated seasons of unusually heavy rain. Reservoirs fill beyond their intended limits, canals run too fast. Earthen dams, built from packed soil and maintained by human labour, begin to seep. At first, people repair them. They pile on more earth. They reinforce weak points. They dig new drainage channels. A society that had spent centuries managing water would know exactly what to do. But every repair requires dry days, organised labour, stored food and confidence that the next flood will not come before the work is finished. Now imagine it does. A breach in one embankment is not just a local problem. Water rushes into fields. It cuts new channels through roads and canal banks. It deposits sand and silt where rice should be growing. It turns carefully levelled paddies into waterlogged ground. And unlike dryland crops, rice does not simply survive any amount of water. Rice needs controlled water. Shallow, managed flooding can be productive. Permanent inundation is something else entirely. If young plants remain submerged too long, if roots cannot get enough oxygen, if fields cannot be drained at the right time, harvests fail. That distinction may have been fatal. Liangzhu's wealth rested on surplus rice. Surplus fed craft specialists who carved jade. It supported elites, builders, traders, ritual workers, and the labour forces needed to keep dams and canals functioning. A good harvest did not just fill stomachs, it kept the entire social system moving. But a sequence of bad harvests could reverse all of that. First comes scarcity. Grain stores shrink. Then comes pressure on the people who control distribution. Communities that once sent rice, labour, or tribute toward the central settlements may begin keeping more for themselves. Distant villages may stop maintaining canals that no longer benefit them. Trade networks weaken because boats cannot follow reliable routes through flooded or clogged waterways. Labourers who once built monuments are needed at home, trying to save fields, repair houses, or move families to higher ground. And the hydraulic system itself becomes a trap. This is the paradox at the heart of Liangzhu. Its waterworks were extraordinary precisely because the landscape was difficult. The city did not rise despite the wetlands, it rose by organising them. Reservoirs captured water, dams restrained it, canals redirected it. Fields turned it into food, transport routes turned it into power. But a system that's sophisticated can also be fragile. Think of it like a machine with thousands of moving parts. When conditions stay within a certain range, the machine performs brilliantly. But push it beyond that range, and every connected part begins to fail at once. A damaged dam raises pressure somewhere else. A blocked canal prevents drainage. Flooded fields reduce food supplies. Reduced food supplies make it harder to mobilize workers. Fewer workers mean weaker repairs, and weaker repairs make the next flood worse. This does not require a single apocalyptic event. It requires a cascade. A few years of extreme rainfall, perhaps interrupted by brief recoveries, could have created exactly that kind of spiral. People may have rebuilt after one flood, they may even have rebuilt after two. But eventually some settlements would be abandoned. Some fields would be written off. Some communities would move away from the lowlands entirely. The political centre at Liangzhu might have remained standing for a time, surrounded by a landscape that could no longer support the system that created it. And yet we need to be careful. Flood deposits are real evidence of water moving through the landscape. Climate records make stronger monsoons plausible. The timing, broadly speaking, overlaps with Liangzhu's decline around 4,300 years ago. But archaeology has not uncovered a single unmistakable disaster layer across every Liangzhu site, all dating to the same exact moment. We do not have a tablet saying, "The Great Dam broke," or a preserved eyewitness account describing the final evacuation. The phrase "disappeared overnight" is a mystery, not a proven timeline. Liangzhu may have declined over decades, perhaps generations. Flooding may have been the main cause, or it may have combined with political conflict, social strain, disease, changing trade routes and failures within the ruling system. Environmental disaster rarely acts alone. It exposes weaknesses that were already there. Still, the flood theory has one more haunting dimension. Thousands of years later, Chinese tradition preserved stories of devastating floods and heroic efforts to control them. The best known is the legend of Yu the Great, the figure said to have tamed catastrophic waters before the founding of the Jade Dynasty. These stories were written down long after Liangzhu had vanished, and no historian can draw a straight line from Liangzhu's flooded fields to the legend of Yu. That would be speculation. But myths do not emerge from empty landscapes. In a civilization shaped by rivers, monsoons and floodplains, memories of water disaster could survive for centuries, changing with every retelling. A real flood becomes many floods. A local catastrophe becomes a story about the whole world. A forgotten engineer becomes a culture hero who saves humanity by bringing rivers under control. Maybe those later traditions preserve no direct memory of Liangzhu at all. Or maybe deep inside them there is an echo of an older world in the lower Yangtze, where people built a civilization by mastering water, then learned that water could never truly be mastered. But even if the floods broke Liangzhu's system, they did not erase its people. The cities may have fallen silent, the canals may have filled with mud, the jade workshops may have stopped, but people do not vanish as easily as civilizations do. But what if the crisis was not only coming from the sky? What if by the time the floods arrived, Liangzhu was already carrying stresses that its rulers could no longer control? This is one of the hardest questions in archaeology, because the people of Liangzhu left no royal chronicles, no angry letters from farmers, no records of palace conspiracies, no list of officials arguing over grain supplies while canals failed and rice fields drowned. We have walls, tombs, jade, damaged landscapes, abandoned settlements. We have the physical remains of a system, but the arguments inside that system are gone. Still, complex societies leave clues. Liangzhu was not an equal world. The difference is visible in the graves. Some people were buried with little more than basic pottery. Others were laid to rest with extraordinary quantities of jade, including Kong tubes, discs, ceremonial axes, and objects carved with the strange divine face that seems to stare out from Liangzhu's ritual world. That means wealth, labour, and probably political power were concentrated in a relatively small part of society. And concentration can be incredibly effective when everything is working. A central authority can organise thousands of workers to build dams. It can direct food surpluses into storage. It can support specialised jade carvers, ritual leaders, engineers and traders. It can make decisions quickly, mobilise labour and turn a wetland into a capital. That is how Liangzhu became Liangzhu. But there is a darker side to that kind of power. The same system that can build a reservoir can also demand labour when people are exhausted. The same elite that distributes grain can decide who receives it first. The same rulers who organise rituals promising cosmic order can lose legitimacy when the rivers stop obeying. Picture a farming community after several poor harvests. Their fields have been damaged, their grain stores are low. Their houses need repair, their children need food. Then representatives from the centre arrive and demand workers for an embankment project, or rice for storage, or materials for another ritual construction. In good times, that obligation may feel worthwhile. The central system provides trade, flood control, protection, prestige, perhaps access to sacred ceremonies. But in bad times, the calculation changes. Why send your strongest workers away when your own fields are failing? Why surrender grain when your family may not survive the winter? Why obey leaders whose great waterworks have failed to protect you? Those questions can weaken a society faster than an invading army. Political fragmentation is one possibility. Liangzhu controlled a large cultural world, but control does not necessarily mean every village was governed in the same direct way. Some settlements may have been loyal allies, others may have been tributary communities, others may simply have participated in the same trade and ritual networks without taking orders from a single ruler. When resources became scarce, those connections could begin to break apart. Distant communities might have stopped sending labour toward the capital. Local leaders may have kept grain and jade for themselves. Rival centres could have challenged the authority of Liangzhu's elites, not necessarily through dramatic battles with armies storming city walls. Conflict in early societies can look quieter than that. A village refuses orders, a trade route shifts, a canal goes unrepaired. A local chief decides that the capital is no longer worth supporting. One by one, the threads holding the network together begin to snap, and there may have been tension within the elite itself. The Grand Jade burials suggest that Liangzhu's ruling class had access to enormous resources. Jade did not simply appear in the tombs. Stone had to be obtained, moved, cut, drilled, polished and transformed through astonishingly time-consuming labour. Every elite burial represented a claim on the work of many other people. That kind of system depends on belief. People must accept that certain families, ritual specialists or rulers have the right to command labour and accumulate sacred objects. But crisis can make old beliefs unstable. If floods came repeatedly, if harvests failed, if the landscape that leaders claimed to manage became unpredictable, then the authority attached to those leaders may have begun to fade. Maybe people no longer believed the rituals worked. Maybe rival ritual traditions gained followers. Maybe the sacred face carved into jade, once a symbol of cosmic power, became a reminder that the old order had failed. We cannot prove any of this directly, but we know from later history that inequality makes societies vulnerable during disaster. Not because wealthy elites automatically cause collapse, but because unequal systems distribute pain unevenly. The people with the least stored food, the least secure land, and the fewest political connections are often hit first. If enough of them lose the ability or willingness to support the centre, even a powerful state can become hollow. Then there is disease. Wet, crowded environments can create serious health risks, especially when flooding disrupts clean water, food storage, and settlement patterns. People moving between villages can carry infections farther than usual. Malnutrition weakens immune systems. A disease outbreak turns a food crisis into a demographic crisis. But disease is among the hardest explanations to identify in deep prehistory. Skeletons sometimes preserve signs of illness, but many infections leave no clear trace on bone. Epidemics can tear through a population and then disappear almost invisibly from the archaeological record. So disease remains possible, but not proven. Trade could have mattered too. Liangzhu was connected to a much wider world. Jade materials, crafted goods, ideas and prestige objects move through networks extending beyond the lower Yangtze. Those networks helped sustain elite power. A ruler who can obtain rare materials and distribute impressive objects is not just wealthy. They demonstrate that their authority reaches beyond the horizon. But trade networks are fragile. Flooded routes, population movement, shifting alliances, or the rise of competing regional centres could all disrupt the flow of goods. If access to jade or other prestige materials declined, the political order built around them might have been weakened. Not destroyed overnight, weakened, then weakened again. This is the key to understanding collapse. Archaeologists rarely find one clean cause because human societies are not built from one clean cause. Flooding affects harvests. Failed harvests create hunger. Hunger produces migration and conflict. Migration spreads disease. Conflict disrupts labour. Disrupted labour weakens infrastructure. Weak infrastructure makes the next environmental shock even worse. A civilization can survive one problem. It may survive several. But eventually, the problems begin feeding each other. So perhaps Liangzhu did not fall because of a single flood, a single war, a single epidemic, or a single rebellion. Perhaps it unravelled through a chain reaction. Some places were abandoned early. Some communities adapted. Some elites lost power. Some farmers moved to safer ground. Some trade routes continued while others died. The capital may have declined long before the last traces of Liangzhu culture vanished from the landscape. From far away, thousands of years later, that long, uneven process looks like disappearance. But for the people living through it, there may have been no single final day. There may have been only one hard season after another, one decision to leave, one failed repair, one empty granary, one abandoned canal at a time. And when Liangzhu's centre finally lost its grip, its people did what people have always done when a world becomes unlivable. They moved. They moved. That sounds obvious. Almost too simple for a mystery that has lasted more than 4,000 years. A great centre declines. Its canals fill with mud. Its walls fall silent. Its elite tombs stop receiving jade. And the first question we ask is, what happened to the civilization? But that question can hide another, more important one. What happened to the people? Because a culture can disappear from the archaeological record without its population vanishing. A capital can be abandoned without every family dying. A political system can collapse while the farmers, fishers, craftspeople, and children who lived under that system keep going somewhere else. Liangzhu may not have been a story of extinction. It may have been a story of transformation. Think about the geography. Much of the Liangzhu world was built in low, wet terrain around the lower Yangtze. That environment had made the civilization rich. Water carried people and goods. Floodplains supported intensive rice farming. Wetlands offered fish, reeds, wild plants, birds, shellfish, and transport routes connecting settlement after settlement. But when water became too abundant, the same landscape turned dangerous. If repeated floods damaged the lowlands, people would not necessarily wait for one final catastrophic event. Families could move gradually, village by village, toward higher ground. Some may have shifted to foothills, some could have moved inland along river valleys. Others may have resettled on more stable terraces where fields were less productive in good years, but safer when the rivers rose. Not everyone would have gone in the same direction. And that matters. Liangzhu was never just one city. It was a network spread across a huge region, held together by rice farming, ritual traditions, trade, engineering, and shared ideas about power. When the centre failed, that network may have broken into smaller pieces. Different communities responded to the same crisis in different ways. Some stayed and adapted, some moved, some joined neighbouring populations. Some may have carried Liangzhu traditions into regions where archaeologists later see a different cultural name, different pottery styles, different burial customs, and a different way of organising society. This is one of the biggest traps in archaeology. We give cultures names based on objects. Liangzhu pottery, Liangzhu jade, Liangzhu settlement patterns. Then, when those objects change, we can be tempted to imagine that the people themselves have been replaced. But people are not pottery. A family can change the shape of the pots they make within a generation. They can adopt a neighbour's tools, marry into another community, alter their rituals, or stop producing luxury goods because the elite system that demanded them no longer exists. Their descendants may look archaeologically different while still carrying memories, skills, genes, and habits from the world their grandparents left behind. After Liangzhu's decline, the lower Yangtze did not become empty. Archaeological sites in the surrounding region show continued occupation, though the old Liangzhu order was gone. Settlement patterns shifted. Material styles changed. New regional traditions emerged in some places. The evidence suggests communities were reorganizing after environmental disruption rather than simply disappearing. The details are debated, and the transitions are not always clean. Archaeologists do not have a perfect map showing exactly which Liangzhu village became which later village. But the broader pattern is clear enough. Human life continued. Farming continued. Communities continued adapting to the rivers. And some parts of the old world may have survived in ways that are almost impossible to see. Rice is one possibility. Liangzhu farmers had developed highly productive wet rice agriculture, supported by careful water management and generations of local knowledge. Knowing when to plant, how to manage flooded fields, how to select seed, how to store grain, how to work with a changing wetland landscape, that knowledge did not need a palace to survive. It could live in households, it could pass from parents to children. It could travel with migrants to new settlements. The same may be true of ritual. The exact Liangzhu system of elite jade burials ended. The great concentrations of Kong tubes, by discs, ceremonial axes, and carved sacred faces no longer appeared in the same form. But ritual traditions rarely vanish all at once. Symbols can be simplified. Sacred objects can be reused, old stories can be retold with new gods, new ancestors, and new local meanings. Jade itself remained important in later Chinese history. That does not mean every later jade tradition came directly from Liangzhu. History is never that simple. Different communities can value the same material for different reasons, and cultural ideas can travel in many directions. But Liangzhu had already demonstrated something powerful. Jade could be more than decoration. It could represent rank, ritual authority, ancestral connection, and access to a world beyond ordinary life. That idea had a long future, and here is where the mystery becomes frustrating, because Liangzhu left us no written self-description. No surviving text says, "We fled the flooded plain and settled beyond the hills." No ruler recorded which families stayed loyal. No migrant wrote down the names of the rivers they crossed. Without writing, identity becomes incredibly difficult to trace. Archaeologists can compare pottery. They can study burial styles. They can examine rice remains, animal bones, house foundations, flood deposits, and the chemical signatures in human teeth that sometimes reveal where a person grew up. Ancient DNA may eventually add more answers, though southern China's warm, humid conditions often make DNA preservation difficult. But none of those sources can fully tell us how people saw themselves. Did a displaced Liangzhu family still call themselves Liangzhu? Did they preserve memories of the old capital? Did they see the flood as a punishment, a natural disaster, or simply a terrible season that never ended? Did their children grow up hearing stories about jade-filled tombs and massive walls hidden beneath the reeds? We may never know. If you enjoy mysteries like that, the channel's book on 12 unexplained mysteries goes deeper into stories where the evidence is real, but the final answer remains just out of reach. You can find it on the website, with the link in the description. What we can say is that collapse does not have to mean a people were erased. The farmers who knew the rice fields may have moved their knowledge elsewhere. The craftspeople who understood jade may have passed techniques into new communities. The ritual specialists may have reshaped old symbols into forms we no longer recognize. Local populations may have absorbed newcomers, while newcomers adopted local customs. Over generations, the boundaries blurred. Eventually, nobody may have been purely Liangzhu anymore. But Liangzhu could still have been inside them, not as a surviving kingdom, not as an unbroken dynasty, but as inherited practices, remembered landscapes, exchanged traditions, and people whose descendants continued living along the rivers of eastern China. So the real question may not be, where did Liangzhu disappear to? It may be, how much of Liangzhu survived by becoming something else? And that takes us to the next chapter of the story. Because long before China's first dynasties claimed the landscape, the people of the lower Yangtze had already learned how to build cities, control water, grow rice, organize labor, and turn ritual objects into political power. That last idea is the key. Long before the Shang kings cast bronze vessels and carved oracle bones, long before the Zhou spoke of the mandate of heaven, and long before Qin emperors imagined a unified empire, people in the lower Yangtze had already built a society that looks unmistakably important in the long story of China. Liangzhu was not the first Chinese dynasty. It did not leave a royal genealogy that can be traced to later emperors. It was not simply an early version of the Shang, waiting to become more familiar. And we have to be careful here because there is a powerful temptation to draw one clean line through the past. Liangzhu becomes Ya, Ya becomes Shang, Shang becomes Zhou, and suddenly the entire history of ancient China looks like one continuous march toward empire. Real history is messier than that. Liangzhu flourished in the lower Yangtze, in a wet, rice-growing world of canals, marshes, dams, and jade. The later Bronze Age states most familiar from Chinese history rose hundreds of miles away, especially in the Yellow River region, in landscapes shaped by millet farming, lowest soils, different river systems, and different political networks. There was also time between them. Liangzhu's great centre declined around 4,300 years ago. The early Bronze Age states that archaeologists can identify more clearly emerged later, under conditions that had changed dramatically. Populations had moved, technologies had spread, regional cultures had risen and fallen. New systems of warfare, long-distance exchange, and political authority were taking shape. So no archaeologist can honestly point to one Liangzhu ruler and say, that person's descendant became a Shang king. The evidence does not allow it, but that does not make Liangzhu irrelevant to later China. In some ways, it makes Liangzhu even more important, because it proves that complex civilization in ancient China did not begin in one place, with one people, or through one simple political lineage. It emerged from many regions at once. The lower Yangtze was one of those regions. The Yellow River Basin was another. The northeast, the middle Yangtze, the southeastern coast, and the western highlands all had their own communities, their own technologies, their own sacred traditions, and their own experiments with power. Ancient China was not born fully formed. It was assembled over thousands of years from many different worlds. And Liangzhu was one of the earliest and most extraordinary of those worlds. Its jade is probably the clearest example. Later Chinese societies treated jade as a material of enormous significance. It became associated with wealth, moral virtue, status, ritual, purity, protection, and the world of the dead. Elite tombs from later periods contained jade pendants, ornaments, masks, suits, discs, and ceremonial objects. Rulers and nobles used it to display rank. Philosophers used jade as a metaphor for the qualities of an ideal person: beautiful, durable, refined, yet strong. That sounds remarkably close to something Liangzhu people may have understood more than 5,000 years ago. For Liangzhu elites, jade was not just expensive decoration. It was transformed through enormous labour. Raw stone had to be acquired, shaped, drilled, polished, and carved with incredible precision. Some objects were buried with the dead in quantities that must have represented a lifetime of work. The mysterious Kong, the smooth bi-discs, the ceremonial axes, and the carved face motifs suggest that jade carried authority reaching beyond ordinary life. Power made permanent in stone. But similarity is not proof of direct inheritance. Jade was valued across a wide area of prehistoric East Asia. Ideas can spread through trade, marriage, migration, imitation, and ritual exchange. Different societies can independently recognize that a rare, difficult-to-work material is perfect for expressing prestige. And over thousands of years, symbols can change so completely that their original meanings disappear. A Liangzhu Kong is not the same thing as a Han Dynasty jade burial suit. A carved Liangzhu face cannot simply be called the ancestor of every later Chinese god, dragon, or imperial symbol. That would be turning possibility into certainty. Still, the continuity is worth noticing. Across enormous spans of time, Jade repeatedly became a language of power in Chinese societies. It marked the body. It accompanied the dead. It connected elites to ancestors, heaven, the natural world, or sacred forces beyond everyday experience. Liangzhu shows that this language was already being spoken very early. The political landscape changed even more dramatically. Liangzhu's rulers, if that is what they were, governed through a wetland centre, hydraulic engineering, agricultural surplus, ritual prestige, and the ability to mobilize labour. Later states developed other tools of rule. Bronze production became central to elite power. Armies became larger and more organised. Fortified centres expanded. Kings claimed authority over wider territories. Writing, at least by the late Shang period, gave rulers a new weapon, the ability to record divinations, sacrifices, lineages, warfare, tribute, and royal decisions. That changed everything. A state with writing can preserve orders beyond a single human memory. A state with bronze workshops can equip warriors and reward allies. A state with armies and administrative systems can demand resources from communities that may never see the ruler himself. Liangzhu was not that kind of state, but it had already solved some of the same fundamental problems. How do you organize thousands of people? How do you control food? How do you turn labor into monuments? How do you convince communities to accept hierarchy? How do you make power feel sacred? Those questions did not begin with the Shang. They were already being tested in the flooded plains around Liangzhu. And that is why its rediscovery changed the historical map of early China. For a long time, the story of civilization focused heavily on the Yellow River, especially the central plains where later dynasties built capitals and left written records. That region was undeniably crucial, but it was not the only engine of complexity. Beneath the rice fields of the lower Yangtze was evidence of another centre, a city with walls, a planned landscape, massive water control systems, elite tombs, specialised craft production, long-distance exchange, deep social divisions, a ritual world expressed in jade. Not a footnote to later civilization, a civilization in its own right. Liangzhu forces us to see ancient China not as a single river flowing toward dynasty and empire, but as a vast watershed, many streams, many peoples, many experiments. Some disappeared. Some merged, some survived in altered forms, and eventually from that complicated landscape, later Chinese states emerged. But the world they inherited was already old, and that is the real reason the Liangzhu mystery still matters. Not because it gives us one more lost kingdom to add to a list. Not because it proves that some forgotten super-civilization ruled all of Asia. And not because every unanswered question needs a dramatic answer. Liangzhu matters because it forces us to confront how much human history can be built, transformed, and nearly erased. More than 5,000 years ago, in the lowlands around the lower Yangtze, communities created something astonishing. They planned settlements on a monumental scale. They raised walls and platforms in a landscape where water was both the source of life and a constant threat. They built canals, dams, reservoirs, and drainage systems that reshaped entire watersheds. They grew rice intensively enough to support large populations, craft specialists, elites, labour crews, and people whose work was no longer simply finding food for the next day. They turned mud, water, wood, stone, and human labour into a political landscape. Think about what that required. A dam is not just a pile of earth. It requires people to agree on where it goes. It requires knowledge of rainfall, slopes, rivers, soil, and seasons. It requires someone to organise workers, feed them, direct them, and make sure the structure is repaired when the rains return. A canal is not just a ditch. It changes who has water, who has transport, who can grow more rice, and who depends on whom. The Liangzhu landscape was infrastructure, but it was also power. Then there was Jade. Liangzhu craftspeople took hard stone and worked it into objects of extraordinary precision. Kong tubes, bidiscs, axes too delicate or elaborate to have been ordinary tools. Carved designs that may show faces, animals, ancestors, spirits or symbols whose meanings are now beyond recovery. These objects moved through elite networks. They were placed in graves. They marked certain people as different from everyone else. The living saw them. The dead took them underground. And that tells us Liangzhu was not just organized. It was imaginative. It had rituals. It had hierarchy. It had ideas about authority powerful enough to demand labor from thousands of people and meaningful enough to send precious objects into the earth, never to be used again. But then, around 4,300 years ago, the great centre was abandoned. Not necessarily in one night, not necessarily because of one flood. Archaeology almost never gives us a clean ending like that. What it gives us is silence. The monumental landscape stops being used in the same way. Large-scale construction ends, elite burial traditions change or disappear. The dense concentration of people around the capital breaks apart. A civilization that had dominated its region for centuries no longer appears in the archaeological record as the same unified system. Why? Researchers have clues. Sediment records point to major environmental instability in the lower Yangtze around the time of Liangzhu's decline. Stronger monsoon rains may have brought repeated flooding. Water control systems designed to manage ordinary seasonal variation may have been overwhelmed by extremes. Rice fields could have been damaged. Transport routes could have failed. Low-lying settlements may have become impossible to maintain. But climate pressure is not the same thing as a complete explanation. A flood can destroy a harvest. It does not automatically destroy a political system. For that to happen, the crisis has to spread. Food shortages create unrest. Failed infrastructure weakens confidence in leaders. Elites lose their ability to mobilize labor. Communities stop sending tribute, stop obeying orders, or simply leave. A system built around controlling water can become dangerously vulnerable when water stops behaving predictably. That is one possibility. There may also have been conflict, disease, migration, internal political struggle, or a slow fragmentation that archaeology cannot yet see clearly. Perhaps Liangzhu's rulers demanded too much from the people below them. Perhaps rival communities challenged the centre. Perhaps the population dispersed into smaller settlements that survived, while the capital-centred system did not. We don't know, and that phrase matters. We do not know the names of Liangzhu's rulers. We do not know whether they called themselves kings, priests, chiefs, or something with no modern equivalent. We do not know exactly what the jade face meant. Was it a god? An ancestor? A mythic being? A symbol of political office? We do not know what language Liangzhu people spoke, because no confirmed writing system has survived to tell us. Marks on pottery and objects may have carried meaning, but they have not unlocked a lost archive. Most haunting of all, we do not know what the final years felt like to the people living through them. Did they watch floodwater rise over fields their grandparents had reclaimed from the marsh? Did labourers repair broken embankments again and again until the effort became impossible? Did elites perform rituals with jade as their authority weakened? Did families leave by boat, carrying rice seed, tools, children, and memories of a city that could no longer protect them? Those questions are not evidence. They are human possibilities. And we have to keep that boundary clear. Liangzhu is extraordinary without turning it into Atlantis. Its engineers were brilliant, but there is no need to claim impossible machines. Its rulers were powerful, but there is no evidence they controlled all of Asia. Its disappearance was dramatic in archaeological terms, but overnight is a way of describing the shock of the record, not a proven timetable of a single catastrophe. The truth is more interesting than exaggeration. A real society built real systems to manage a difficult environment. Those systems helped create wealth, population, ritual authority, and political power. Then environmental change and social pressures may have exposed the limits of that success. That is not fantasy. It is one of the most recognizable stories in human history. We still live with it. Modern cities also depend on infrastructure so normal that we barely notice it. Levees, reservoirs, drainage tunnels, power grids, food networks, ports, roads. We also build in floodplains. We also trust engineering to hold back water. We also know that climate risk is not only about one storm, one drought, or one failed harvest. It is about what happens when interconnected systems fail together. Liangzhu does not offer a simple warning from the past. Ancient and modern societies are not the same. But it does remind us that complexity is never invincible. And it reminds us of something else. Entire worlds can vanish without leaving a single sentence behind. No royal chronicle, no final proclamation, no account of the last debate, the last ritual, the last journey away from the city. Just raised earth beneath rice fields, broken pottery, buried jade, ancient channels visible from the air, and enough traces in the ground to tell us that, once, a civilization stood here. And yet, Liangzhu did not stay silent. For thousands of years, its greatest city lay beneath the modern landscape of the lower Yangtze. Rice fields covered old foundations. Villages stood near buried canals. Farmers walked across ground that had once been part of a capital, a place of raised platforms, defended walls, ceremonial spaces, workshops, waterways, and the graves of people buried with jade, more valuable than anything most of their neighbours would ever possess. The city disappeared from living memory, but it was never truly gone. It was waiting beneath the mud deposited by ancient floods, waiting beneath fields planted season after season, waiting for archaeologists to recognize that the strange mounds, ditches, and scattered artifacts were not isolated remains from small farming villages. They were pieces of something much larger, a planned wetland capital, a civilization built around water, sustained by water, and perhaps ultimately brought down because water became impossible to control. That is the image to remember, not a mythical kingdom ruling every corner of Asia. Not a lost empire with impossible technology. The evidence does not support that. Liangzhu was something more real and in some ways more impressive, a major pre-dynastic civilization in the lower Yangtze, capable of organizing enormous labor forces, creating complex hydraulic landscapes, sustaining intensive rice agriculture, producing extraordinary jade ritual objects, and concentrating power on a scale that forces us to rethink what China looked like before its first dynasties, before the Shang, before the Zhou, before written historical records could tell rulers' stories in their own words. Liangzhu was already there, and then its era ended. Maybe stronger monsoon rains turned seasonal water into repeated disaster. Maybe floods breached embankments, filled canals with sediment, ruined fields, and made the lowland capital increasingly difficult to inhabit. Maybe climate instability created years of unpredictable harvests and food shortages. Maybe the pressure exposed divisions that had always existed beneath the surface, elites demanding labour, communities resisting authority, rival groups competing for land and resources. Or maybe several things happened at once. That is often how complex societies fail, not through one dramatic moment, but through a chain reaction. One system weakens another. Flooding damages food production. Food stress creates political tension. Political tension makes coordinated repairs harder. Infrastructure fails more often, people leave, trade networks shrink. Ritual authority loses its power. A capital that once pulled an entire region toward it begins to come apart. But we have to be careful. Archaeology can reveal walls, sediments, graves, tools, rice remains, jade, and the outlines of vanished waterways. It can show that a landscape changed, that a settlement was abandoned, that traditions transformed. What it cannot always give us is the final conversation, the final decision, the exact moment when families understood that they were not coming back. There is no excavated tablet that says the flood destroyed us. There is no confirmed inscription saying the rulers failed. There is no single piece of evidence that closes the case. And that uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Archaeological humility means resisting the urge to turn fragments into certainty. It means saying perhaps when perhaps is all the evidence allows. It means recognizing that the people of Liangzhu were real human beings, not props in a simple collapse narrative. They may have suffered, they may have adapted, many may have moved away, carrying skills, beliefs, farming practices and memories into other communities. The capital vanished. The people did not necessarily vanish with it. Somewhere beneath the rice fields, beneath roads, homes, warehouses, and expanding cities, more of their world may still be waiting. Another settlement, another burial ground, a preserved wooden structure, a canal system that changes what we think we know, maybe even evidence that brings us closer to understanding how Liangzhu was governed, how its people worshipped, or why its great centre fell apart. That is why this civilization refused to stay buried. Every new excavation brings it back into the light. Every jade object, every buried embankment, every layer of flood sediment forces history to become bigger than the old dynastic story. So what do you think is the most convincing explanation for Liangzhu's decline? Flooding, climate instability, internal social stress, conflict, or a combination of forces that no single discovery can fully untangle? Let us know in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. If you enjoyed this journey into the world before China's first dynasties, please like, subscribe, and come back for the next mystery buried beneath history. And the best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify. The link is in the description.